Welcome to World Building Films, where we analyze the world settings and rules of films and TV shows to see if they work, if they don't, and if not, how they could be improved to enhance their stories. And today, we're talking about Avatar.
Well, at least they're hot.
Yes, that one. Alright, jokes aside, we all know this franchise has a reputation to say the least. And yeah, not gonna lie, those criticisms are definitely valid. But hey, credit where credit is due, it is still visually impressive, and most importantly, where the story lacks, the world building does surprisingly have a lot of thought put into it. And hey, guess what this channel's all about? So that's what we're gonna talk about here today, to see if the world Cameron created, Pandora, and all the people and creatures in it actually make sense or not. Hold on though, because before we continue, I have to make a big disclaimer first. As of right now, we only have 2 movies out of a planned 5 out of this franchise. This means that, in order to be fair, we should be waiting for the other films to come out first and see what secrets and what world building aspects James Cameron still has for us. The problem with that though is that James Cameron took over a decade to come out with one sequel, which is just as long as it takes me to make these videos, and I'm not willing to wait for the machines to take over before we can make a proper review. Regardless if that happens sooner than later. So yeah, I still wanted to give it a shot anyway, and in fairness, I want to get some of these ideas out of my head. So, as soon as the other sequels come out, I will happily discard all of this and review the entire world building properly. So just keep that in mind from here on out. It's a temporary review. And by the way, yeah, there's a lot to say here, so this will also be a multi-parter, just to let you know. And yes, I will do my best to keep Avatar The Last Airbender jokes to a minimum. Don't worry, you're safe. For now. Before we start though, you know what won't take a decade to do? Why, clicking to the subscribe button so you can get more great world building content and analysis in the future. So let's not waste any more time and jump right into it. This is the temporary world building review of James Cameron's Avatar. What works? So if we want to review the inner workings of Pandora, I think it's fair to acknowledge what does work first. Because, in all honesty, there is a lot that does hold up on its own already. So let's get back to the basics. The franchise is set almost entirely on Pandora, which, is important to note, is not a planet, but is instead one of 5 moons orbiting a much larger gas giant called Polyphemus. On Pandora, we see that the entire satellite is rich with all sorts of life, from plants to animals to, yes, the most prominent living species there, the Na'vi. 9-foot-tall, blue cat-like people who are very strong and agile and live in a tribal type of civilization, hunting for food with sticks and arrows, riding wild beasts, living in huts, etc. You know the drill. Pandora does have though some more prominent features. For example, the Hallelujah Mountains, which are enormous chunks of rock that simply float high into the air and stay there the whole time. Not gonna lie, for the longest time I was actually convinced that these mountains float because of Polyphemus' superior gravity pulling everything towards them. But my bad, it turns out they actually work for different reasons. See, it turns out that these mountains are using something called magnetic levitation, also known as the maglev effect for short. Basically, most conductive materials are able to allow the passage of electrons through their form, but in the process, some of those electrons can get lost, so you don't get the full transfer you'd like. However, if you were to supercool said materials, then they become superconductive, meaning that now there is absolutely no friction or loss of these electrons. When this happens, if they're under magnets, these superconductors can actually float, giving the impression that they're even locked in midair. And supposedly the infamous unobtainium that humans are looking for, yes, I know, the name is stupid, is what causes these levitations to happen in the first place, because it's a superconductor that doesn't require to be cooled down to work. Alright, fair enough. Then there's the other particularity. On Pandora, it turns out that all living beings can actually connect with the Na'vi until they form a sort of symbiosis and can communicate emotionally and telepathically. So much so, there is actually a main neural network across the planet, mostly stemming from tree souls, which the Na'vi praise like their god and might have its own sentience. In fact, all of Pandora seems to kind of work as one giant hive mind, which is made of a collection of memories and minds, so much so that even Grace's psyche is uploaded into this thing when she quote-unquote dies, although we'll get more into detail with her later. So yeah, very interesting. And yet it doesn't even stop there. There's potentially a lot of things that actually do work here, even if they're not explicitly said in the film, and even if they could use a few tweaks here and there. Like, think of the plants, for example. Almost all the vegetation on Pandora has a bioluminescence of its own, to the point that some even glow when touched or stepped upon. And this actually might make more sense than one might think. Cause see, Pandora isn't just any moon, but online sources say that, much like our moon here on Earth, Pandora is actually tidally locked to Polyphemus. For those of you who don't know, a tidal lock is when a celestial body is always pointing one side of its surface towards a larger celestial body nearby. Again, like how our moon works. So Pandora always has one side facing towards Polyphemus whenever it goes around it, while still having this day-night cycle. By the way, I don't actually have a model of Pandora, so every now and then I'll just be using this as a reference. However, that does mean there will be some implications that aren't fully explored here. For example, this day-night cycle will be potentially slow, yes, but even assuming you're on the side where it's dark, you'll still have plenty of daylight, because Polyphemus will be reflecting back a lot of the sunlight that it gets. It's like when we have a full moon lighting our surroundings, except this is a whole goddamn planet as big as the sky. It won't be as intense as the sun, but it'll still be super bright. And heck, that's not even counting that Pandora has two suns, Alpha Centauri A and Alpha Centauri B. The only period in which Pandora faces actual full night will be when it faces a planetary eclipse when it enters Polyphemus' shadow. And even then there will still be some slight traces of light still in the sky. Because of this, Pandora almost receives an excess of solar light. And with only such a short time frame for a full nighttime, it must need to release some of that stored sunlight. Hence, while not specified like this, I think that's why all the plants release it during this nighttime as bioluminescence. Hell, it's such a prominent feature on Pandora that even the animals and the Na'vi have their own bioluminescence on their very skin. It honestly makes pretty good sense. Although, in all honesty, I think that nighttime in this case would have some unintended consequences. If even true night is illuminated by the flora and fauna, this means it would be impossible for predators to be stealthy and for prey to be able to hide. Because the slightest movement would cause shifts in these lights on their bodies and be a dead giveaway unless they're impeccably camouflaged and just stay still there the whole time. So I think that all the Na'vi and all the creatures would actually have a sort of power down moment during full nighttime, making sure that they're as still and quote-unquote on standby as much as possible, and maybe that would be the time in which they take the opportunity to rest, brief as that rest might be. Which means that nighttime would have an even bigger cultural and religious significance for the Na'vi. So much so that to them, disturbing the night is seen as a great offense. And yes, that means that people like Neytiri will be making a cultural defiance in order to participate in the final battle in Way of Water. She was already struggling with the idea of having to leave her home for the safety of her family, and her fighting during the night to save her family would be the ultimate way to show her defying her own traditions and completing this character arc, and in this way, make her even more badass. Come on, it's right there! There's only benefits for this idea! Speaking of the Na'vi, by the way, the fact that they're so big and elongated can make sense too, because Pandora is about 20% smaller than Earth, so its gravity will be a tiny bit weaker, meaning that the square cube law won't be as prominent, and thus they can develop to be these towering beings. So, yeah, all things considered, James Cameron did do a pretty decent job in creating the world of Pandora, or at least the basic foundations for it. So much so, he created an entire catalog of plants and animals and far more, and there's so many that, quite frankly, even I couldn't cover them all here. But with that said, even if the foundations are great, there are still some unanswered questions here. And so let's dive into them to see how they could be fixed and explained, starting with gravity. So, as mentioned earlier, places like the Hallelujah Mountains are explained by having this maglev phenomenon, and it's not caused by Polyphemus' gravity nearby. Alright, cool and all. But are we really still going to ignore the giant blue elephant in the sky? Cause let's face it, Polyphemus is still up there! Are you seriously telling me that that giant thing in the sky is not influencing anything gravity related at all on Pandora? The system doesn't even have the excuse that we have here on Earth with our moon, Because at least here, while the Earth is far bigger than the Moon, the two are way further apart. So much so that when astronauts go on the Moon, they don't really feel that influence. With this other system, yes, Pandora is smaller than Earth and so it has less of a gravitational pull on itself, but it's way proportionally smaller than Polyphemus. I mean, just look at it! The planet is covering the whole damn sky and that's a gas giant. It's like saying Earth was orbiting around Jupiter. We would be feeling at least something, right? So that means that this one element would be making major changes on how Pandora should actually work. For example, when Polyphemus is in the sky, that means that not only the Hallelujah Mountains would have an extra reason to remain afloat because they're having this extra pull, but all the other creatures would technically have this lift as well. Even if the pull isn't strong enough to make them float like they're in space, they should all at least be able to make great jumps with ease.
Beyond your dream, you can fly? No, jump good.
Yet we just see them all walking around as if gravity was perfectly normal. And granted, one could say that it's because of Pandora's atmosphere, which has high amounts of gases like xenon, methane, and hydrogen sulfide, and would make the air much denser and could sort of compensate with this gravitational pull, which would be a fair point, but remember, denser does not mean heavier. And even if it did, the atmosphere there is like 1.2 times denser than that on Earth, which, if you put next to the 20% reduction in gravity, they kind of cancel each other out. So yeah, that doesn't make sense, and yet it was just so close to making sense. Because it turns out, there was an element that could have helped in all of this, and that is the animals of Pandora. Cause see, they all seem to have around 6 limbs, giving them the nickname hexapods. Now granted, it's stated that because of this denser atmosphere, they have these extra limbs to have better traction on the ground when they're running. Which again, could be fair, but I think these extra limbs could have been used to move 3-dimensionally in space in a lower gravity. By having 2 limbs grab onto whatever rock, branch, tree, or whatever they find in the air, and then have below them an extra pair of limbs to grab, claw, attack, or do whatever. It's right there. It makes so much sense, and yet I don't think those limbs can be justified entirely if Pandora doesn't have Polyphemus's gravitational pull. Except maybe for the Dio horses, cause let's face it, in an area with low gravity, I'm not sure how useful hoofs would be. But anyway, that's not the only change that gravity would cause. Cause see, this wouldn't have been a problem if Pandora actually rotated on its axis, and yet, as we saw earlier, it's actually tidally locked. This means that there will always be one side of Pandora facing Polyphemus and its superior gravity, the sides where the gravity is kind of pulled sideways, so trees would likely be angled sideways towards the gas giant, and on the other side of Pandora it would actually be a lot heavier because it's being pulled through the entire moon. And that's not even counting the tides. Think about it. Here on Earth, we actually have tides because we have our moon influencing and giving us this slight push and pull. On Pandora, it's flipped, because it has forces pulled by a much greater force, and that means that all the water would be flowing towards one side of the moon, which is actually the side that faces Polyphemus. Which means that, yes, the positions of the Omoticaya and Mitcaina clans would almost be switched. The Mitcaina would be near the oceans, which is the side that is always facing Polyphemus, meaning that they're the only ones who would actually see Polyphemus in the sky 24/7 right above them. The Omoticaya lived in the rich forest areas, which at this point we can say is near the ring of the planet, the moon, goddammit. Of the moon, and for them, Polyphemus would always be on the horizon for them, never in the sky above. And yes, this would mean that there would be an entire side of Pandora that's actually almost deserty and dry because all the water was sucked away. And no, the tribes there would never see Polyphemus in the sky, meaning that there could even be debates between all the clans as to whether Polyphemus actually does exist or not, depending on where you live. At least assuming they can't communicate with each other through the tree souls, but whatever. And what's frustrating is that apparently in the next films we are eventually going to be meeting a sort of pseudo-fire deserty clan of the Na'vi who live in the desert areas. Don't make less Airbender jokes, don't make less Airbender jokes, don't make... But if you look at the official maps of the goddamn place, there doesn't seem to ever be any sort of desert there, so... What is it, Cameron? Just pick one. Oh, and speaking of Cameron, just a small side note to clear the air. Some actually would debate that all of this is pointless because Pandora isn't tidally locked and rotates on its axis, as proven by the fact that we often see Polyphemus in several positions in the sky, indicating that if it moves, so should Pandora itself, which would be a fair point, but remember, this is James Cameron we're talking about. The same guy who apparently had the wrong freaking sky in Titanic and didn't realize it until Neil deGrasse Tyson pointed it out to him.
So at the POV, the point of view of Rose, as she's looking up deliriously to the sky, there's only one sky she should have seen, and it was the wrong sky. But not only that, the left side of the sky was a mirror reflection of the right side of the sky.
Did you call James
So it was
Cameron?
lazy. I called him, no reply. It's back
Can
in
he fix that
1996.
shit?
I saw it when it first came out. No reply. 5 years later, I bump into him at a meeting, and he says, well, at the time, I was not overseeing post-production, and that's when we added that.
So yeah, look, I'm not even trying to throw shade at Cameron. It's just to say that I'm fine with chalking these off as just technical mistakes on a fictional planet that, let's face it, is already really hard to keep track of, and they favored the rule of cool above logic this one time. Alright, we'll let you go this time, Jimmy. Now back on track. Now we talked a lot about how the physics would affect Pandora a lot differently, but we should also get into detail as to how the Na'vi and their culture works. Because trust me, there's a little detail that seems to have been overlooked that would actually have major implications. But if you want to find out what that is, you will have to join me next time in part 2 of these videos of the world building of James Cameron's Avatar. So stay tuned for part 2, and as always, keep building worlds.